You know, I have to admit, the source material for this deep dive, it really kept me up last night. Not because it was gruesome, exactly, but, well, it felt like reading a magic trick being explained. I mean, think about how we usually process history. The big stuff. The things that end up in textbooks.
Right, you mean dates, battles, the fall of empires, that kind of thing.
Exactly, but more than that.
Yeah.
We assume history is anchored by death. If a lot of people die, we remember it. The Titanic sinks, we remember. A plague hits, we name it.
It's the standard equation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Death equals significance. If the loss is big enough, the history books have to record it.
That's what I thought. But this document we're breaking down today, thousands died and history stayed silent.
I mean, it just completely upends that entire idea. It's proposing something that feels, honestly, impossible.
It is a disturbing paradox.
It's talking about situations where the deaths are confirmed, the bodies are counted, the numbers are undeniably real, but the event itself, it doesn't exist. And we're not talking about ancient history, where records were lost in a fire or something.
No.
This is a framework for modern bureaucratic societies. The text calls it acknowledged loss without historical presence.
That phrase, acknowledged loss. So they're not even denying that people died.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And that's the critical distinction here. This isn't a conspiracy theory we're looking at. It's not a government cover-up with people burning files in secret.
So what is it?
It's actually much more mundane, which I think makes it 10 times more terrifying. The whole mission of this deep dive is to figure out the mechanics of it. How can you have a massive death toll without a tragedy?
See, that's the part I can't wrap my head around. If I die and you die and 1,000 other people die, how is that not a tragedy? How does that not get a chapter in the history books?
Well, let's start with the first section of the source. They call it the paradox of proof. You're assuming that if you have proof, a story has to follow.
I mean, yeah, if I find a receipt for $1 million, I assume a big transaction happened.
But what if you have the receipt and no one will tell you what was bought? The source points out that in these cases of silent history, the proofs are actually everywhere.
Everywhere? Like where?
Well, casualty figures that just appear in secondary documents
Wow.
or compensation records. Money is literally changing hands.
Wait, so the government, or whoever is responsible, is actually cutting checks?
Often, yes. The source is very clear about measurable demographic gaps. You can look at census data, at actuarial tables, and literally see a hole where a group of people used to be.
So the data is public. It's sitting on library shelves.
Exactly. It's not hidden in a vault.
It's just orphaned.
Orphaned is a really good word for it. The source argues, and this is a great line, the numbers survived, but the context did not.
Wow.
Imagine walking into a library and finding a ledger that just says minus 5,000 for the year 1995. No explanation, no battle, no great flood.
Just a statistical adjustment.
Precisely. It's loss without classification.
And it feels so bureaucratic. Like, oh, we just adjusted the inventory of humans.
And that's the feeling the text evokes. In normal history, we classify things to remember them. We call it the Great Depression or the Cold War. Those labels are like boxes in our brains.
Right, and once an event has a box, we can store memories in it. We can teach it.
And without the box,
The information has nowhere to go. It just dissolves.
it vanishes. Not because the ink was scraped off the page, but because it was never organized into a story in the first place. There's no subject heading for you to look up.
Hold on. How do you actually pull that off? I mean, logistically, you have thousands of grieving families, you have money moving around, a demographic dip. Someone is going to ask questions.
You would think so.
Mhm.
But the source argues you don't need to suppress the questions if you can just diffuse the answers.
Okay, that sounds ominous.
And that brings us to the next section on what it calls administrative silence.
Administrative silence. It sounds so boring.
It is boring, and that is its superpower. The source argues that if you want to bury a tragedy in plain sight, you don't use soldiers.
You use bureaucracy.
You use bureaucracy. You make it so tedious, so complex, that a single clear narrative can never gain traction.
Okay, so walk me through an example. The source lists a few mechanisms. Absorption, language, diffusion. Let's start with absorption.
Okay, think about a normal mortality curve for a country. Every year, a certain number of people die from all sorts of causes. Heart disease, car accidents, old age. It creates a kind of background noise of death.
Morbid, but yeah, I follow.
Absorption is when a specific acute event, let's say an industrial disaster that kills a few thousand people, isn't tallied separately. Instead, those numbers are just poured into the general mortality bucket.
So instead of a report saying 3,000 people died because the water was poisoned, it just says kidney failure rates were up 4% this decade.
Exactly. The death is real, the number is there, but the cause is absorbed into a broader trend. It becomes a statistic, not an event.
You hide the specific tragedy inside the general misery.
That's a perfect way to put it. And it's incredibly cynical
Yeah.
and incredibly effective. Because who's going to argue with a 4% variance in kidney failure? It just looks like bad luck.
Right. And that must lead right into the second mechanism. Language.
It does. The source points out how very specific words are used to strip the emotion and meaning out of the loss. They use terms like incidental, or collateral, or statistical deviation.
Incidental. That word always gets me. It makes it sound so small, like, oh, I forgot my keys. It was incidental, not I lost my entire family.
It's clinical. It removes the victimhood. If you're an incidental loss, you're not a victim of a crime or a tragedy. You're just a side effect.
It depersonalizes it completely, which I guess makes it harder to be angry.
It makes it impossible to be angry at a person. Which brings us to diffusion, the third mechanism, and maybe the most powerful one.
And what's that?
It's where responsibility is spread so thin that it just evaporates.
I feel like I see this all the time, even in small things. It's like the Spider-Man pointing meme, but for bureaucracy.
It's the architectural equivalent of that meme, yes. The source describes a situation where a disaster is the result of 50 tiny decisions made by 50 different departments. The engineers, the budget committee, the safety inspectors, the local council, the contractors.
So if everyone is 2% responsible,
Then nobody is 100% responsible.
there's no villain. There's no single bad guy to put on trial.
There's just a system that failed. And, as the source notes, you cannot put a filing system in prison.
You can't put a filing system in prison? Wow. That should be on a bumper sticker. But it creates this wall. If I'm a survivor and I want justice, where do I even punch? I'm fighting a cloud.
And that's why the silence holds. To break a silence, you usually need a clear story. This bad thing happened because this person did this.
But here the story is just paperwork.
The story is,
Yeah.
a bad thing happened because 1,000 mundane forms were processed correctly, but yielded a poor result. That's not a story. And history almost never records paperwork.
Okay, so it creates this barrier of boredom. It's too dull to be remembered. But I want to push back a little on the why. Because we always hear that history is written by the winners, right? The motivation is usually to make the people in power look good.
That's the classic view, yeah.
But this source seems to be suggesting something deeper. It's not just about ego or propaganda. Why choose this complicated silence if the number's already known? Why not just spin it?
Because spin requires acknowledgement. And acknowledgement starts a chain reaction that the system can't control.
What kind of chain reaction?
The source lays out this logic chain that I found really compelling. It goes like this. Acknowledging an event requires an explanation.
Sure. If you say the Great Fire, you have to explain how it started.
And an explanation requires accountability. You have to find the spark. And accountability. Well, that's what destabilizes the existing narrative.
Destabilizes them how?
The source uses a really powerful phrase here. It says, some deaths don't fit the story being told. Think about our era, or any era. There's a dominant narrative, a main plot. Maybe the plot is technological progress or national unity.
Okay, so the country has this sort of main character energy.
Exactly. Now imagine an event happens that completely contradicts that theme. A massive failure of technology in an era of progress. An act of division in an era of unity. It's not just a tragedy, it's a plot hole.
It breaks the immersion.
It creates narrative dissonance. And humans hate narrative dissonance. We want the story to make sense. So the source argues that history itself effectively acts as an editor.
An editor.
Yes, it just cuts the scenes that don't advance the plot.
That is. Wow. So it's not about truth, it's about coherence. We'd rather have a history book that flows nicely from chapter 1 to chapter 2 than one that includes all the messy, contradictory footnotes.
We prioritize a clean story over a complete ledger. If a death is inconvenient, not just politically, but narratively, it gets left on the cutting room floor.
The system chooses silence just to keep the story intact.
Exactly.
That idea of history as an editor is chilling because it implies there's no malice, not necessarily, just a desire for a good story. But let's ground this because we're talking about systems and narratives, and I feel like we're doing the exact thing the source warns against. We're abstracting the loss.
That's a very fair point. We are intellectualizing it.
And the source has this section on the aftermath, on the human cost. And it's just brutal, because what happens to the actual human beings left behind when their loss is, technically acknowledged with a check in the mail, but historically non-existent?
It creates a unique kind of psychological torture. I mean, usually when a big tragedy happens, there's a social contract. We mourn together. We build a monument. We have anniversaries.
Right, there's a script for grief. You're a widow of the war or a survivor of the flood. People know how to treat you.
Exactly. The public acknowledgement validates the private pain. But in this framework of silence, that validation is completely stripped away.
So what happens?
The source lists the consequences. No public mourning, no official memorials. Or, if there are memorials, they're tiny, private, funded by the families themselves, often hidden away.
So imagine you're at a dinner party, someone asks about your family, you say, "Oh, my brother died in the unnamed event," and everyone just stares at you.
They stare because they've never heard of it, they didn't see it on the news, they didn't learn about it in school.
Isn't that crazy?
You sound like a conspiracy theorist. And that's the isolation the source is talking about. It says the silence doesn't erase the loss, it isolates it.
The tragedy becomes a private burden. You're carrying this massive weight, and society is essentially gaslighting you. It's saying, we paid you, why are you still upset? Why are you bringing this up?
Why are you bringing up something that doesn't fit the story?
That isolation, it feels almost worse than the erasure. If the government just denied it happened, you could be angry, you could be a rebel. But here, you're just a statistical anomaly.
That's the exact term the source uses. Survivors are treated as statistical anomalies. You're not a victim of history. You're just an outlier on a data set.
And that prevents any collective memory from ever forming.
It remains 1,000 individual sadnesses instead of one shared tragedy. And eventually, once the generation that remembers passes away, if the administrative silence has held, the event ceases to exist.
It becomes archaeology, just bones in the ground.
That's the end point.
Which brings us to the synthesis, I guess. The source wraps this all up by reframing that old cliche we always use. History is written by the winners.
I think we need to retire that phrase after reading this. I really do. The source proposes a much better one.
Which is?
History is structured by what can be explained.
Structured by what can be explained. That loops right back to the narrative coherence. If you can't explain it simply, or if the explanation hurts the system, it just doesn't make the cut.
It suggests history is a filter. We filter out the inexplicable, the inconvenient, the messy. The source uses this metaphor of a retention engine. Think of history not as a recording device, but as a sieve.
And the administrative silence we talked about, the absorption, the diffusion, that's the mesh of the sieve. It's what catches the uncomfortable truths and keeps them out.
Precisely. The text also brings up the metaphor of the ledger, again here at the end. It says the official history feels like a ledger that balances, but never tells you what was lost.
That's the bureaucracy winning. The books balance, the budget is reconciled, the compensation was paid, everything looks tidy.
But the meaning is gone. And the final assessment from the text is just incredibly bleak. It says, the records remain incomplete, and eventually silence becomes the official version.
That word eventually is doing a lot of work there. It's not instant. It's a slow erosion of truth over decades.
It is, and it serves as a warning. We tend to view history as this solid, objective thing. But this deep dive really shows us that history is more like a garden. It's curated. Things are pruned. Weeds are pulled.
And sometimes whole sections are just paved over because they don't fit the landscape architect's design.
And we, walking through that garden, we usually just admire the view. We don't ask what used to grow under the pavement.
We just assume that if it was important, it would still be there.
This text challenges us to look for the cracks in that pavement, to look for the demographic gaps, to read the footnotes in the news and ask, why is this loss being described as incidental?
It's a tool for critical thinking. It's about listening to the silence.
That's a beautiful way to put it. We have to listen to the silence just as closely as we listen to the noise.
Before we wrap, I want to leave our listener with one final thought that hit me reading this. We've been talking about this as a historical thing, how the past gets edited.
Right.
But think about the world right now.
We're living in the age of big data.
The most recorded civilization in human history. Every click, every movement, every transaction, it's all tracked. We have more proof than any society ever.
We are drowning in proof.
But if this source is right, if history is only what can be explained within the current narrative, then the amount of data doesn't actually matter.
That's the frightening implication, isn't it? You can have petabytes of data, but if the narrative structure decides that data is incidental, it effectively deletes it from our cultural memory.
So, how many events are happening right now, this very moment, that are technically being recorded? The video exists, the data is on a server somewhere, but will effectively never have happened in the eyes of history.
How many of us are already just statistical anomalies in a story that hasn't even been written yet?
It questions the very idea of legacy. We assume our digital footprint guarantees will be remembered, but it might just guarantee we become part of the background noise in some graph.
The data survives, but the meaning might not.
That's a heavy note to end on, but I think a necessary one. So next time you see a statistic scroll across your screen, maybe ask yourself, what story is this number not telling?
And who decided that story wasn't worth telling?
Exactly. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. It was a complex one, but I think we're all looking at our history books and our news feeds a little differently now.
It was a pleasure.
See you next time.